Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Security Noise, free Active Directory. Today we do have Sean Metcalf with us, who is probably one of the foremost experts on security as far as that goes, both Entra ID and on-prem directory services. We also have Skyler Tutor here, who will make sure our show sounds great. He may be a little quieter here than usual because I think he's had some dental work done real recently.
Yeah, just a bit. Numbed up.
I am your host, Geoff Walton. I run our application security practice at TrustedSec. And with that, we'll have a little bit more conversational episode here where we talk to an expert and get their thoughts on some critical security infrastructure. And with that, we will go on to announcements. If you want to join the show on Discord, that is discord.gg/TrustedSec. You can contribute topics, show ideas, and interact with Skyler and some others about anything you've heard on the show. Additionally, I do have one This Week in InfoSec item that's kind of interesting. Krebs Security was hit with a 6+ terabyte denial of service attack. You can, of course, go to his website to read more about that. But interestingly enough, it looked to be mostly a test of a botnet to see how effective that could be. And perhaps more interestingly, between Google and Cloudflare, it was not successful. In fact, according to Krebs's blog, he didn't really know anything about it until it was long over. So not a good demo if you're trying to show off how much of a threat your botnet is. But it is interesting how these denial of service attacks are maybe not what they used to be in terms of internet threats. And with that, I will go ahead and throw things over to Sean and give him a few minutes here to introduce himself.
Hello, thank you. I'm Sean Metcalf. I am a Microsoft Certified Master in Active Directory, one of about 100 in the world, and I work at TrustedSec as the Identity Security Architect, which means that I look at and poke around Microsoft identity and try to figure out what's going on with it, find some issues, and provide a lot of good advice on how best to secure those environments, so specifically Active Directory and Entra ID.
Very good. Well, I know you recently presented at RSA. One of the main subjects of that is kind of who is in your Azure tenant. You want to talk a little bit about that and maybe give us some of the key bullet points there?
Yeah, absolutely. So my talk was called Your Microsoft Tenant is the Attacker's Computer. So a little bit of a variation of a theme that's been around for a while, talking about those security issues and misconfigurations that can enable attackers to take advantage and become global admin, get full rights to the Entra ID tenant, formerly Azure AD. And as part of the talk, I cover how they get to global admin and then what they can do with global admin. It seems fairly obvious that the global admin can manage and administer all of Entra ID, but one thing that is often missed is that global administrator has the ability to jump over to Azure itself and become the enabler of user access and controlling the IAM, the identity access and management within Azure. So once you have that right, that applies to the root of the Azure environment, which includes all subscriptions. So then you can basically make yourself whatever you want to within that subscription, any subscription, which means that the attacker has the ability to push out ransomware. They can install run code as system because that's how it's configured as a virtual instance in Azure. And probably most dangerously, if you have virtual domain controllers in an Azure subscription, they can actually install run code on that, which could then replicate those changes to your on-prem Active Directory domain controllers. So pretty interesting stuff around that. The key issues that I talked about were what we call level 0 roles within Entra ID. These are the tier 0 roles, the ones that are most powerful. There are 5. I also talk about the level 0 application permissions, those that are the most powerful, that have effective global admin rights associated with them, and what can be done with that. So looking at owners of applications, owners of role assignable groups, a lot of different terms I just threw out there, but there's a number of things that I cover as part of the talk to really identify the best way to find these things and tighten them up. I'm also working on a blog post that I'll get published through TrustedSec in the near future, probably next month, that correlates with the things that I talked about at RSA.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely look forward to the blog. I guess kind of a first question on that. is you mentioned a lot of identity technologies there, and then certainly on the show we have discussed things like conditional access and stuff before as far as what people should be doing. But in your experience, having done audit work for a lot of customers, done a lot of hardening and reviews, what's the biggest thing that people miss at, I guess, let's say the administrative IT level of Active Directory?
It's a good question. The challenges that I see are most commonly what I would characterize as the sins that we have done on-prem are being performed and are still the same in cloud. One of the things that just boggles my mind is how frequently I see a standard user account that's a member of a highly privileged role within Entra ID. That's way too common. Seeing that there are applications that have these highly privileged rights, very highly privileged rights, because the application company, the company that wrote that application, says it needs those rights. But if it's been around for many years, say 5 years, there's probably a different role that's more granular, or a different permission that's more granular that could be assigned and associated with that application, so that way it could still do what it needs to do without having full access. One of the things that's really challenging right now in Entra ID is applications that have highly privileged rights, basically, like I said, global admin rights, and they have that forever. They continue and persist with that right. And there's ways to actually add a credential to that application depending on the configuration and the environment. Most of the time, for what we see, there are standard user accounts that have the ability to add a credential to that application and take over and impersonate that application.
Is there a certain class of applications that tends to be affected the most? I mean, way back when, I knew anything that used to plug into Exchange or something always managed to land in the domain administrators group. Are we seeing something like that today with messaging apps, maybe AI apps that are supposed to be going through our corpus of corporate literature and things like that? Or is it pretty much a mixture of everything that you find offends?
Yes. Well, with on-prem Active Directory, we have a fairly good understanding of what are the accounts that really need highly privileged rights. Those applications have been around for a while. Typically, it's a fairly sizable company that has a sales staff and has developers, and they have put some time and effort around understanding that. It's better today than it was, say, 5 years ago, especially with service accounts and the rights that they have. It's very different in the cloud. The cloud is kind of still like the Wild Wild West. One person can go ahead and publish an application that they wrote to the cloud environment, and before you know it, that application is deployed at 10 different companies or dozens of different companies and organizations with these very highly privileged rights and permissions without fully understanding what that actually represents, what that means. One of the things that really shocked a recent customer that we did an assessment for was the Exchange read-write capability. So they have the ability to write messages and read all messages in Exchange Online. And so that was one that was shocking for them. And we identified the attack path, the escalation path, where a standard user had the ability to actually have that right on Exchange and Exchange Online. So they were very concerned about that and got that tightened up.
If I have an application in the cloud that has one of these highly privileged roles, maybe it is assigned something like global administrator, are there better logging tools than there were in the on-prem DS days to figure out exactly what rights it's actually using, what resources that application's actually touching, so that I could maybe tighten the screws down on that?
It's getting better. It used to be that an application or the service principal associated with the application didn't have any logging associated with it. There are now sign-in logs. There's logging that's in preview that provides some better identification of what's happening with those accounts. The best way to do it is to look from the top down, though, identify what applications have which permissions and which are the permissions that are most concerning, and then start with that and kind of work from that perspective around the problem to identify what are the applications that are highly privileged.
And what's the kind of attitude developers and stuff have? Because again, I think back on, the early 2000s when converged networking was hot and, everybody was trying to integrate all those messaging applications and stuff like that. There wasn't a lot of willingness on the part of application vendors in most cases to work with you at all. If you were trying to secure the environment, it was, no, you have to give our application domain admin, or it's got to be, Exchange admin, that kind of stuff. Has the culture around that shifted, and how has that migrated to the Entra ID cloud world?
Sure. So with the on-prem environment, it's better than it was. It's not great. It's still not where it needs to be, but it's definitely better than it was. With Entra ID and the configurations around that, like I said, it's kind of like the Wild Wild West, where you can pick out an application. You may not have a whole lot of familiarity with it. We tend to see the same sort of applications that are part of that are sort of grouped together. A lot of times they're backup and recovery applications. Some of them have to do with messaging. The ones that are probably the most egregious are the ones that are targeted towards, say, SharePoint, but it has full rights to everything. And that's when you can look at it and go, okay, why does this SharePoint thing need directory read write all, for example? That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's also an application permission, which I can't think of at the moment, but it effectively allows the application to grant permissions of any type to anything, any application, any user, basically anything. And that's one of the ones that is most egregious that we see sometimes, because an application shouldn't need the right to then configure additional permissions for itself and for others.
You think the problem is a lack of understanding of the permissions model on the part of the application developers, or is it more that they don't think that the people deploying their applications in the environments are going to be able to follow the complex instructions to or provide a security principal with a more specific set of enumerated rights? What kind of drives the loose and over permissions?
I think one of the things that has gotten better in the past 10 years is the level of granularity that is available with permissions and with roles. So when I first started with Azure AD, there were a handful of roles available. Now there's over 100. So there's a lot more granularity in the roles and certainly in the permissions that can be used and leveraged by an application. And unless that application owner and developer is staying up to date with what Microsoft is pushing out on a regular basis, I mean, I get an email every week about new updates that have occurred in Entra ID. It's difficult to keep track of that. So this is where what we've done with Active Directory is we've pushed back on the vendors and we said, okay, you don't need domain admin. Tell me what you really require. The same thing has to be done with Entra ID as well.
Well, let's change gears a little bit here. Let's look at this from the perspective of an Entra ID owner, so to speak. I'm responsible for the Entra ID environment in a medium business or something like that. We've been growing organically maybe for the last 5 or 6 years, and I've never really done kind of a security audit. Just been creating users in Office 365 and stuff as I go. What would you tell me that I probably should be worried about or should start doing immediately?
Check the privilege roles and make sure there's no standard user accounts that are members of those roles. That's probably the big one. Make sure that there's requirements around MFA for admin accounts, preferably through conditional access or at least security defaults, which is configured by default on new tenants. Making sure that the default rights for users are not set to default and continued as default. Users have the ability to consent to applications, which could be malicious applications and often are these days. So that needs to be changed so that they can only consent to applications that are known to be benign and normal and regular ones that Microsoft has identified. Block the ability for the users to create new tenants. That's something that they're able to do by default. The users have the ability to view all other users as well. That's something that they shouldn't have or don't need. Along those lines of sort of unintended or unfortunate defaults for user accounts I just covered, but there's also guest accounts as external accounts. So some unfortunate defaults for that is that guest accounts can invite other guests by default and can see pretty much everything that users can. So those need to be changed. There's a number of things that should be done in the environment to tighten it up, but those are some of the easier, quicker wins that can be performed.
So I know if I have some of the higher licenses and stuff, I can access tools like access reviews and stuff like that. If I don't have some of those things, or if I need to get a little bit more depth in that, are there any free tools or stuff that I can get started with? The equivalents of like Bloodhound or something that as a domain administrator I might want to start using?
As far as free tools for the Entra ID side, I mean, Bloodhound does look at a number of things, but it pretty much focuses on Azure. Probably from the lockdown protecting side, CIS publishes some guidelines around that, so that should be helpful.
Okay. Are there any tools that will actually run the benchmark for me and tell me what accounts are out of compliance or anything like that?
Outside of CIS, I don't know.
Okay. All right. Well, that's kind of a good overview of the Entra ID world. Let's go ahead and pivot back to that Active Directory DS world a little bit and talk about some things that you see on the internal pen tests. Active Directory has, I think, really, as long as I've been doing pen tests, been in one form or another the sort of initial foothold into a lot of systems for a long time, whether that's, listening to LLM and R traffic and passing a hash or something like that. But what's the foothold scenario look like today?
It's really around Active Directory certificate services, probably the number one issue in Active Directory environments. With assessments that we perform, we see 95+% of them are relating to a critical issue with ADCS. We actually did an assessment recently, and we found that there were 3 certificate templates with dangerous misconfigurations that could enable an attacker to request a cert to the name of any object in the domain, up to and including AD admins or a domain controller. So that's a big issue. That's a big problem, and that happens a lot. The other thing that we find as issues is around Sorry to interrupt, but just to explain that one for some of our listeners, the idea would be that I, as the user, Geoff, can go ahead and ask for a certificate from Active Directory Certificate Services that says I'm Sean Metcalf, who may be the domain administrator, and then I'm going to present that certificate to some other machine and claim to be Sean, correct? Exactly, correct.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. So with Azure AD Connect, now called Entra Connect, that is an issue because it's a synchronization engine that has the ability to pull hashes from the environment and be able to then synchronize those up with Entra ID. So that's a common issue that we see, as well as we see that NTLM is not configured to v2 only. It often requires and allows v1. We still sometimes are finding that there's the spooler service running on a domain controller somewhere, which means that there's a number of different attacks that can be performed against the print spooler service. And Kerberos is not out of vogue yet. Kerberos is still around. We still find that there are accounts that are members of domain admins that have Kerberosable passwords that are there, typically 5, 10, 20 years old even. Passwords just aren't updated or changed like they should, especially on service accounts that are highly privileged in the environment.
Speaking of Kerberos, I know a while back, a lot of admins were really trying to get to turning off NTLM entirely and getting to a Kerberos only domain. Is that finally realistic, or is that still not something that you see?
I believe Windows 11 and Windows Server 2025 now have the ability to support a Kerberos only type environment. The issue, if you can imagine, all of these different applications, all these different systems that are out there that have been configured to fall back from Kerberos to NTLM, still like working through that. So I believe we're at a state where it's possible. I'd say in most environments, it's not going to happen for quite a while. The systems and environmental variables that really matter when it comes to going to even NTLM v2 only are a lot of the Nix type appliances. So Linux, Unix type appliances or applications that are out there. Sometimes, or a number of times, it's because of those that we can't get to NTLM v2 only. So if you can imagine getting up to NTLM v2 is a problem, then Kerberos can be an issue as well.
Is that still something you'd recommend to people to have as an objective to get to a pure Kerberos environment if they could do it?
Yeah, it's certainly a stretch goal, let's say.
Okay. Speaking of some of the Linux and Unix stuff that wants to maybe integrate with Active Directory, obviously, the MIT Kerberos package has worked for a long time to do basic operations, get a ticket, use it type stuff. Is it mostly appliances that you find aren't able to do this, that are maybe, pull a print server off the shelf, stick it in the rack kind of thing? Or is it actually like Linux and Unix servers that you see software on that can't speak Kerberos?
Yeah, most of the time it's those appliances that are the ones that have the biggest issue. The thing that always confused me about a Nix-based application is that oftentimes when it talks to Active Directory, it wants you to provide it with 1 or 2 or 3 domain controller IP addresses, which is very interesting to me because the way that you discover domain controllers, the way that Windows discovers domain controllers is through DNS, which of course has been around forever and is a cornerstone service of Unix and Linux. So I always thought that was interesting. interesting.
Yeah, I wonder why they don't want to use DNS to figure out the KDC. I guess I hadn't really observed that, but most of the time, when it came to deploying Nix servers and stuff like that, they were in the data center. You wanted to use the adjacent domain controllers anyway, so.
Right. Yes.
I guess maybe that's part of the reason, since that stuff is not really desktop oriented, and therefore it makes less sense to discover and more sense to sort of ask the administrator what's nearby.
It's easier. Exactly. Right.
Okay. In terms of things to be concerned about on our local directory service environment, obviously, rotating passwords and stuff on service accounts. Hopefully migrating to managed service accounts. Do you still see applications typically using an ordinary user account a lot, or yeah?
Yeah, most of the time there's actual service accounts that have been around for 15, 20 years that are still in place, still in use. And the group managed service accounts, we see more of those being used, but still it's the minority for the most part. We've seen a couple environments that are mostly GMSA, so they've obviously put a lot of time and effort into doing that and shifting and migrating towards GMSAs. Group managed service accounts are basically accounts in Active Directory where Active Directory manages the password associated with it. So that way you don't have to worry about that password. That password gets changed about every 30 days. It follows the same cadence as the computer account password. So it's something that will get changed on a regular basis and is long and complex.
And that showed up, if memory serves, around like Windows Server 2012. Was that right? Or was it even earlier than that?
GMSAs, I believe, came out in 2008, and then GMSAs came out in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sure there's someone right now that's saying Sean's wrong. But that seems to be what I remember.
Needless to say, it's only been a decade, people. Get your act together. Well, I guess with some of these things in mind, and I know there's a lot of issues where on a pen test you see whether they get that foothold on the Entra side or whether they get it on the local Active Directory side. Again, they take advantage of that replication to migrate from either the on-prem environment to the cloud or vice versa. What are some of the things that enable that specifically, and how do you try to control those?
So the biggest one is Entra Connect. That's probably bar none the area. We also see attackers going after systems like CyberArk. We've looked at CyberArk environments and identified that there are exploitable opportunities for attackers around CyberArk, because CyberArk tends to manage the on-prem Active Directory privileged access administrator accounts, as well as Azure AD, now Entra AD. So that's another area of opportunity for attackers, and especially since there is some guidance from CyberArk on how to securely configure CyberArk and deploy it. Unfortunately, that guidance isn't always followed.
Would you recommend actually using two deployments of that type of software, one that lives in the Entra world and one that lives in the local world, just to prevent, both sets of accounts being in one place?
That would definitely help minimize or mitigate the level of impact, sort of what's been termed as the blast radius, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I can definitely see, getting hold of one of those services and using it maliciously. I know on pen tests I've seen people get access to SCCM or something like Case and actually deploy malicious packages with it and things like that. And I would think that would be a real quick, easy, and effective way to get between on-prem and the cloud in a lot of cases.
Absolutely.
Are there any specific, I know some of the early Federation stuff before Entra Connect even, there were some key accounts and things that had to be protected that enabled that password replication and things of that nature. Can you speak to that? What does that look like today?
I think that's mostly been handled. I'm not familiar with any keys that are replicated along with that. I think that was probably the old DirSync configuration.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So no longer concerned there. There's no special privileged accounts that Entra Connect uses.
I mean, Entra Connect has a service count that's configured, and if this express access express configuration is utilized in order to deploy it, there are concerns about the service count and the rights that it has and that Entra Connect server itself. So that should be protected as tier 0. And then on the cloud side, so there's the on-prem Active Directory component, and then there's the cloud component. And so there's a service count on each side. That service count has to be stored in the database so that it understands how to communicate and how to do updates. So that is an area that is It's important. It's most critically important in order to protect Entra ID as well as your on-prem Active Directory.
Okay. Skyler, any thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts, but I don't think I should be speaking right now.
Sean, any ideas on anything else we should cover? We're probably around our time here, so...
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Sean for joining us today, and I want to thank all of you for listening. Security Noise is a production of Trusted Sec LLC. If you or your organization have any questions or needs with information security, go to www.trustedsec.com. We'll see you next week.